middle leadership job leading primary history. So this one holds a very special place for me. Shriyanti, did you want to say that you're going to start recording?
Yes, that's exactly it. I just started it. There's a note in the chat. If anyone would like to turn their cameras off so they're not on the YouTube recording, please do so now.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So Alex, I met Alex just probably about 10 years ago when we were both tearing our hair out because I think we were both like planning a kind of Stone Age Britain unit from scratch and sort of thinking, why is there not a more comprehensive curriculum offer open for primary children? And in that time, Alex has thought about absolutely nothing else than how to build fantastic primary curriculum programs, and now leads the wonderful primary knowledge curriculum, a partnership of schools who are all thinking about how to construct a fantastic curriculum offer. But with that, I think it's fair to say a special place for history, although that covers lots of subjects, a special place for history for Alex. And as I mentioned before, the wisdom that Alex has gained from working with huge numbers of schools, but also thinking very deeply about how to sequence curriculum, how to teach history really well, how to set up children in primary to have really joyful experiences, is just unparalleled in my view. So Alex, did I miss anything from your biography and what you've been up to over the last 10 years?
No, I don't think so. And like you say, I've been working for the Knowledge Schools Trust. So for the past 10 years, actually, it is 10 years, John, and focusing on a range of subjects. But my baby really is history. History is what I studied did my degree in, and it was such a joy to be able to focus only on history for this book, and to like really get my teeth into it. So yeah, it was great.
Wonderful. So we're going to go straight into it. I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's see if I can do that first of all. Hopefully folks can see a big, mine and Alex's face is really big on a slide, so we'll move on from that as quickly as possible.
That looks like 10 years ago, those pictures. They were very young in those pictures.
It really does, yeah. First of all, I just want to share a little bit about what's included in this book, because we're going to dive into 5 areas, deep dive into 5 sort of focused areas. But just to give you a broad overview of what Alex has set out in this book, you can see the chapter list here. It starts out with this kind of what it means to be a history leader, how leading history is different to leading other subjects. And this series, one of the things that really attracted me to these series was the fact that each book could take the subject seriously, because we know how important subjects are. Teaching, curriculum, assessment, leadership in art and design is just different to leading English or leading maths. And so being able to contextualize subject leadership within the discipline, I know is something that's really important, and something that Alex has set out really well in that opening chapter. There's chapters on research evidence, on the difference between substantive and disciplinary knowledge, designing curriculum and historical inquiries, narratives and storytelling, which I know is really sort of becoming very popular right now, and schools taking more seriously, thinking about disciplinary literacy and how children can speak, read, write, think like historians, progression and assessment, and one of the most common questions that I got when I was talking about curriculum, and especially curriculum in the foundation subjects, was just how on earth do you assess foundation subjects? I think people feel relatively confident with English, maths, reading, writing, but when it comes to those foundation subjects, how do you know that a year 4, for example, is kind of doing well? How do you know that they are kind of where they should be? How do you know how they compare to kids in other schools? So fantastic chapter on progression and assessment. And finally, probably the most important thing that middle leaders do, which is thinking about the implementation of change. So that's the kind of the broad overview. And Alex, if it's okay, we're going to start with this idea of disciplinary concepts, which you dive into in your chapter on substantive and disciplinary knowledge. And I guess that this idea of sort of disciplinary knowledge was probably sort of about 2017, 2018 that teachers started to think about this. And it was definitely new to me in that time. It wasn't, disciplinary knowledge was a completely new term to me, despite having taught and led for a while at that point. And I think it's also fair to say that it was from the history community, the history subject community, that disciplinary knowledge was really kind of pushed as something that was a very important thing for both teachers to know about, but also for children to be introduced to. So would you mind just sharing a little bit about why, first of all, what those kind of disciplinary concepts are, and second of all, why it's important for history primary leaders to know about them and ensure that children have sort of encountered them year on year as they move through their primary school?
Yeah, I think you're right there, John, that I think one of the reasons why it was probably the history community that really pushed this distinction between the substantive and disciplinary knowledge is because in order to sort of improve in history, it takes both development of, you know, your knowledge of history, your substantive knowledge, but also your knowledge of the discipline and the disciplinary concepts. So that the substantive concepts are the concepts that are concerned with the substance of history, this sort of stuff in history like democracy, empire, etc. Whereas the disciplinary concepts are really concerned with the discipline itself. It's like the enactment of the discipline. It's sort of how you bring that discipline, how the discipline thinks and deals with the knowledge. I think it's really interesting when I was doing some reading around disciplinary concepts, like you say, that actually the terminology around even calling them disciplinary concepts is relatively new, and the previous national curriculum referred to them as second order concepts, or sometimes they're known as procedural concepts. And when I was reading it, there was stuff that was further back where there was different concepts listed. So sometimes there were fewer concepts, sometimes they were slightly different. But the concepts that I talk about in the book are the ones that in general is there's a consensus, particularly in England, that these are like the core sort of disciplinary concepts that we're talking about, and they're listed in the national curriculum and in sort of the Ofsted Research Review. The concepts that we're talking about here are on the screen here, and I think this distinction, which I've put in the book, it really helped me when I first heard this, was the idea of the first sort of 5 causation, continuity and change, similarity and difference and significance are the types of arguments that we have in history, the way of thinking about the history, and then the bottom 2 there, sources and evidence and interpretations, being around the processes. And I think it's quite useful to make that distinction. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens over the next 10 years, because maybe in the next 10 years we'll be talking about slightly different concepts, or someone was talking about adding in there've been some arguments around adding in perspective as its own concept, for instance. So this is what, the most up-to-date knowledge we have at the moment, and the way that history teachers are thinking about the discipline and how best to teach it. So hopefully, and then in the book we break down each one to go into a lot more depth in terms of what that looks like from a primary lens, which I think is really important.
I found these, I think, most helpful when I was actually thinking about task design in history lessons, because I'll do my confessional bit here. I definitely in my time did quite a bit of the sort of imagine you're a Roman child and write a diary entry of sort of what you did when you wake up this morning, as well as the kind of a bit of sort of make a pyramid out of sugar cubes. And I'm not saying there's no place. I'm not saying that in primary should have joyful activities as well, and maybe sort of painting a sarcophagus can be sort of like a fun activity. But I think these help me to realize that whilst painting a sarcophagus was like a fun activity for the children, they weren't doing history. They weren't learning history. Whereas if we get children to think about consequence or continuity or significance, or one thing causing another, or what might have caused another thing, that's where we're getting them to kind of do history, right?
Yeah, and we're getting them. I think when we lots of us probably used to teaching a more topic-based approach where the disciplines kind of merged in. So we would sort of think we were doing history, but actually there was a painting task. And I think that there has been a move towards thinking, actually, I think it's quite a good idea that children understand that, you know, what history is, and really value and appreciate the discipline of history. And I think they're really useful, these concepts, for helping us think about the questions we ask children in a history lesson. And if it's not framed around one of these lenses, there's quite a big possibility it's not really a historically framed question. And I know that when we about 10 years ago, John, when we learned a lot from you in the way that you were doing the essay questions with your curriculum, and we started writing essay questions. We weren't calling them inquiry questions, they were essay questions. And some of the questions we wrote, they're like, I laugh now. I remember we actually asked children, were Cassius and Brutus right to kill Julius Caesar? I mean, how problematic is that as a question, sort of morally? But framing the questions around these concepts can be really, really useful. And also these questions, then we can get children to really induct children into the discipline by saying, oh, you know, some historians think that this was one of the, you know, most significant causes, where others have argued this. And you start to then really understand like the nature of history. And I think for me, that's what makes history so interesting, is that there's these different ideas and different discussions. So I think these are really, really useful concepts for us practically in a primary classroom.
Yeah, this idea of like, how do we get to truth? And we get to like, scientists have a different, within the scientific discipline, there's just a different way to get to truth than in history. And historians usually say employ argumentation to kind of try and get closer to truth. That's a useful segue there, because you mentioned a little bit there about inquiry questions. And so if it's okay, we'll skip to your historical inquiry. And I suppose that like there's a klaxon going off probably in lots of people's heads, which is when many of us were training, we were kind of encouraged to do inquiry-based learning, where you would be encouraged to set up the lesson or the classroom in such a way that children would discover for themselves kind of the information that they needed to know about the topic. And for lots of kids, that's kind of disastrous because of everything that we know about the science of learning and kind of prior knowledge being so important. And also, I don't know about you, but when I set up those tasks, there was always some reading involved. You cut out some things for them to read, and it just meant that the kids that were the strongest readers were the ones that kind of made the most progress, because they already had this kind of like quite secure base. It seemed to really widen the gap in my classroom. But so that's why I think maybe some eyebrows raised when you talk about the importance of sort of inquiry questions. So would you mind talking about how you see these two things as distinct, sort of inquiry-based learning versus inquiry questions, and why history should include inquiry questions and the way that it organizes knowledge?
Absolutely. And I think I, like you, John, would steer away from using inquiry-based learning. I don't think that, in my opinion, that the evidence would support that's the best way as a pedagogical approach. But when we're talking about inquiry questions in history, we're talking about something quite different to that approach that you were talking about. I think that the Historical Association, and particularly the secondary teachers, history teachers, have really led the way in terms of thinking about this approach being a really useful approach for teaching history. And the idea really is in school history, what this would look like is that we would have a historically framed inquiry question that would be linked to one of these concepts that we talked about earlier, and that over a series of lessons, children would be provided with the knowledge that they will need to be able to engage with this inquiry question and to be able to hopefully answer that inquiry question. And I think what's really good about this is it's a really purposeful way of engaging with the discipline. And it's a way of using your knowledge. So you're giving children this knowledge, you're building this knowledge up over a series of lessons, and then they're able to do something with that knowledge. And this is very different to inquiry-based learning, because firstly, the children don't choose the question. Writing inquiry questions. I mean, as I say, I've got a history degree and I find it really, really tricky to write a good one. And I know that we went back and forth on a few of the ones that we were writing, and it's hard to get a really good historically framed inquiry question. And I know in the book I've given some sort of top tips on how to do it. The other way it differs is that we're not expecting the children to be able to research this themselves. And I think that's really important because we're talking about primary children, and primary school children aren't professional historians. They're not academic historians. They don't have access to the archives that you would if you were studying history at a much higher level. That, you know, they need that knowledge to be provided to them by an expert teacher and broken down to them. We need to have modelling and scaffolding to support children to be really successful at answering the inquiry question. But I do see actually on some of the forums there was a mixture, because people are saying, oh, I want to incorporate more inquiry-based learning into history, but actually what they mean is using inquiry questions. And the other thing I try and say is that I think with a good inquiry question, that the stuff that where it came from with secondaries is that the idea is that it builds over a series of lessons. This isn't a question you can answer in one lesson. So sometimes I see lots of schools trying to write, you know, lots of inquiry questions for every lesson, and I would not personally choose that approach. This is something that they build to. And what's really amazing is how the children after one lesson might think they can answer the question, and then the next lesson adds to their understanding and makes them question what they learned, and they start to see the nuances and be able to develop a greater understanding over a number of lessons.
And can you, so let's take that one. What led to the fall of the Roman Empire, for example? You're saying one question per lesson is probably, you know, too superficial. How many lessons do you think is about the right balance of an inquiry question would take more than one but less than 10 lessons? What do you think is the right kind of balance for an inquiry question?
I think in the book I said about three to 5 lessons. Like we're not stretching them over. I mean, we don't usually stretch them over sort of 12 weeks, one question. We'd normally do it over a few lessons. So 3 to 5. I mean, in the curriculum that I've written, there's one inquiry lesson for the equivalent of 5 hours worth of teaching. And some of the lessons would add directly to helping them to answer the question. And some of the lessons would just be building knowledge that would support them with understanding. So it's not directly related to the question, but it helps develop that perhaps that sense of period or that overview that they'll then need to be able to answer the question.
Gotcha. And this is a really useful framework for middle leaders, I guess, if they're thinking of okay, so we're currently teaching the Vikings. We don't have any inquiry questions at the moment. We sort of just have LOs for each lesson. We'd like to put some inquiry questions in. Your advice here would be choose one of these kind of disciplinary concepts, and you could even kind of include the wording of what was the consequence of the Vikings raiding Lindisfarne, or what was the consequence of giving the Vikings the Danegeld, or whatever it is. That's a pretty safe way of ensuring that you're kind of getting to a disciplinary valid question, right?
Absolutely. And I think in the book I've got sort of short summaries of every concept with some ideas of wording around how, with some example questions, so you could follow the pattern of the types of questions that are listed in the book, and then you could use that to help to create your own inquiries, which can be, as you say, like a really purposeful way of getting the children to be able to apply their knowledge. And I know my colleague, who I think actually Emma might be on the call, said that she was asking children last week what were they most proud of in their books, and it was these questions where they were sort of saying, look, you know, what they've done and the extended writing. Whereas I think sometimes teachers think, oh, you know, that might be a bit boring for the children to have to write an essay, you know, it's a lot of writing. But actually the kids, this is what they were most proud of, was their responses to these inquiry questions.
That's so interesting, because I had the same response when I was working with a couple of schools who had just started to implement essay writing for primary school children, and the kids were in year 4 or 5. And when I spoke to all the teachers and said, you know, how's this going, they, like, almost all of them said, oh, it's too much writing, you know, we'd like to have a few more sort of like shorter activities in there. And then I did some focus grouping with the children, and the children were all like, we love writing, we want to write more, like because they knew so much, and it's fun to write about stuff that you know a lot about, right? Because you feel really smart and you've got loads to say. They were really enjoying it. But I suppose what else the other thing I really like about this is when I first moved from that kind of inquiry based learning approach where children were frankly sort of just doing craft activities. I think that I then made the mistake of swinging too far to kind of knowledge for knowledge's sake, where it became a bit of a pub quiz curriculum. It was just kind of listing as many facts as possible about the topic. And to your point of like, why are you learning this stuff? What are you doing with it? I hadn't thought so hard about that. So yes, my kids could tell me, the exact year that the Anglo-Saxons, coronated their first king, but they couldn't really talk about these sort of disciplinary concepts. They couldn't say why that was significant or how it changed like life in England. So it feels like a really useful guard against those two sort of those two sins of sort of like a overly inquiry based learning and sort of a knowledge rich gone wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's more true to the discipline because, as I say, when I studied history at university, you would have these essay questions and you would be learning over a series of time, including doing some of your own research because you're obviously you've got more knowledge, more expert, but you would be going towards answering these types of questions. It's what you do in history. So I think that doing that in primary is really useful and really rewarding for the children. I also think that if you're writing a question, you can think about so if we're learning about Stone Age to the Iron Age, for instance, we mentioned earlier, what is the real important kind of residue knowledge that you want children to take away? If you can capture that and then think about the inquiry question that would link to that. So for instance, Stone Age to the Iron Age is such an enormous span of time. And I wanted them to understand that some things stay the same for really long periods. And then other things revolutionized the way that humans how humans organize themselves in terms of like the Neolithic Revolution and agriculture. That is really important from that unit. So I'm obviously going to ask a question around continuity and change. So it's going to lend itself. If I'm looking at the Roman Empire and I'm looking at the rise and fall, perhaps if that's what I really want the children to take away, then that question is going to help direct them to be really thinking about the really important substance of what they're learning, not just knowing the key dates, for instance. But then that can be really useful because it gives more of a reason to have some of that kind of fingertip knowledge, some of the knowledge from a knowledge organizer around key people or key dates, because having that in your head then helps you to think more deeply and use that when you're writing your essay. So it gives a purpose for it too. So I think it's definitely, like you say, it's a really good move forward.
Thanks. Let's move on to this section here on example PD sessions, because you end every chapter with how a middle leader, because this is a book for middle leaders and teachers might find it interesting and senior leaders might find it interesting, but it's a book for folks who are responsible for leading history in their schools or trusts. And so you end every chapter with if you want to do a PD session with teachers that kind of capture everything that's in this chapter, then this is a kind of a useful example. I know that lots of folks will probably go straight to that bit and it will save them quite a bit of time when they're thinking about running their PD sessions. This one is on narrative in histories, and I know that we can probably talk about that for a while, because this sort of the importance of history, the use of narratives in history is really interesting. But could you just talk a little bit about why you've kind of structured the PD session in this way and how this is likely to help teachers to use, in this example, to use narratives more effectively?
Got my book just to make sure I've got the right example up there. I think do you know what, it's really interesting because having the PD sessions I hope will be really, really useful for subject leaders, because I'm in a few subject leader history groups and it's something that comes up all the time, which is I'm going to do a staff meeting for history, what should I do? I think I would add the caveat that you wouldn't just pick up these and just do the staff meeting without it being an area of priority, that we'll look at the implementation practice around, and then you can obviously use these as really, really useful. I think that what we're trying to do with this PD session is get the teachers to really understand the importance of narrative within history first, building that knowledge for the teachers to understand that narrative is really important because it's psychologically privileged, and this idea that that we're able to retain knowledge and learn through story in a way that can be better than when information is presented in a different format. But also how important narrative actually just is to history. That if I'm listening to a historian talking on a podcast, there'll always be narrative. There's, you know, read a history book, there's so much story that's it's, you know, it's a really important mode of communication within history. And then within the training session, what we want teachers to do is to start thinking about how they can incorporate that practically into their teaching. So in this one, it's like modeling to teachers an example of what a good story and a good story could look like, with examples and perhaps some non-examples of, you know, things that you don't want to do when you're using storytelling. Like, for instance, you know, go completely off on a tangent and add in loads of fictional things just for the thrill of the story that's got nothing to do with the actual history. Don't do that, not a good idea. And then get teachers to actually practice and write some stories so that, like, they could even be prepared for the next lesson in this staff meeting. So I think throughout the books, we really learned lots from the EEF's guidance on professional development and what that looks like, thinking about how we build knowledge, but then how we actually get teachers to practice and have a go at doing it themselves. So then they're able to kind of embed that into their own practice, which is the hardest bit. People go to staff training, listen to things, think, yeah, that sounds great, and then, you know, the day-to-day gets in the way and we don't put it into practice. So that's what I tried to do with this one, is get them to actually do something that's going to lead to change in their next lessons.
Yeah, planning a story in an upcoming lesson with those clear frameworks, those sort of like criteria, sort of building that. Then that's something that a skill that they can use in when they're planning any lesson or any unit. I know that Christine Council talks about the kind of the general versus the particular, and how like the general is revealed within the particular, and you talk about sort of zooming in and zooming out. Talk a little bit about sort of like the small scale stories and then zooming out into like the broader bit. Can you talk a little bit about that kind? And sorry, last point is because I can just see up here, you I think really neatly capture how this use of narrative can really get to the kind of inherent diversity within history. You can tell richer stories by telling sort of different stories and different perspectives, and build a broader picture for children. But can you just talk a little bit about that kind of zooming
the scale
in?
switching? Yeah.
I
think it's really, really important thing to do within history, is to always think about the wider scale, like what was happening at kind of a broader level in terms of like the way that what it was like, the broader sense of period of what was going on in the time period, perhaps those larger scale things around sort of politics and governance, and then looking in at like how that played out in the small scale stories, like the micro histories. I remember studying lots of micro histories when I was at uni. It's like looking at the specific stories and then looking at the interconnection between, you know, how, you know, this policy, for instance, you look at from the bigger scale, then how that played out in the lives of individual people. And I think that's what can make history really rich. And then you can also see the differences between, okay, so how it impacted these people, and you realize the switch between that kind of the generalizations that we can make, but also understanding that any kind of generalizations are can be problematic in the sense that, you know, not everyone experiences everything the same, and there are different, we might group all women, for instance, but actually it might be different if you're a rich woman to a poor woman. And just starting to see that diversity of human experience and the richness of that human experience, I think gives you a better picture of history altogether. And like you say, looking at diversity within the storytelling and telling stories from different perspectives and looking at it through different eyes can really help children to have a deeper understanding and appreciation of those stories in the past.
Yeah, I love that. I love that because it's so easy to fall into that trap. But for children, but also for us, I think of imagining there's a neat, as you say, like a neat homogenous kind of how did poor people feel during this period, or and it's making me think about subject like RE and like you wouldn't say all Christians think this, or sort of all men believe this. We know living today that there's a huge diversity of experience, opinion, um, and using that scale switching, I guess, is such a smart way to get to that, and I guess also get to answer the question of like whose history doesn't get told. We talk about the rich and the powerful a lot, but obviously the kind of the richest of history were only sort of 2% of the population. Like what was going on for everybody else?
Exactly. And I think it's a good tool to audit your curriculum in terms of thinking about the different scales, because sometimes we can go down a route where I think we focus a lot on the that you say, like the kings and queens, for instance. But sometimes as well, like with local history, I see it where you really zoom in on specific aspects in history and expect that the children are going to, if you're going to learn about the Roman Empire, for instance, and you decide, I'm just going to focus in on Hadrian's Wall in lots and lots of detail, that you forget that children don't have the broader overview, and then they can't go in as much depth. So with history, that breadth is needed to be able to understand things in greater depth. So scales, switching between those scales, I think is really, really useful. Zooming in and zooming out. Definitely a great tool for us as curriculum designers and within the teaching.
Final question for you is on implementation, because I think that one of the most positive developments over the last few years in education is that schools leaders are really taking implementation seriously and thinking a lot harder about when there's a new initiative or a new approach, or even a new strategy being used, to think carefully about how leaders can make sure that is likely to happen, that's likely to lead to impact, and just sort of telling people in a 5-minute staff meeting or sending an email is unlikely to do that. And in this chapter, you use, as you mentioned, the EEF's implementation guidance. But what I love about it is that you contextualize the whole thing in terms of history, because the EEF guidance is obviously very general because it's for all teachers and leaders. And you contextualize it into a primary history example. You've got this great case study with Faye. So could you just talk us through sort of how Faye approaches implementation as a history leader, and why this might be a kind of a better bet for history leaders and a good kind of example to follow for primary history leaders?
Absolutely. And I think Faye's example is a good one for history leaders, because it's almost like the biggest change you could probably make in terms of a history subject leader. So if you can follow the example follows the EEF guidance in the different phases and sort of shows what that would look like. And I think what's really good about Faye with what she's doing there is that she's identified that the reason it's the biggest change is because she realizes she needs to change the curriculum.
It's a bit of a mess.
Bit of a mess. The curriculum's a bit of a mess, and changing your curriculum is probably one of the biggest things you could possibly hope to do as a subject leader. I think that one of the things from the start, she's very aware of her own limitations and time. So she's not going to say, okay, I'm going to, do everything myself. She thinks, you know what, I'm not going to be able to do this myself. So she looks at different schemes, but she doesn't just, ask somebody she knows and goes with, the first one she hears about. She spends some time thinking about educating herself in terms of what like a good one would look like, thinking about her school context and what would work for her. And then she looks at a number of different approaches and spends some time thinking about how they're working in other schools. I think I said she goes to visit other schools that have got these different approaches, looking at similar contexts in terms of the school demographic, and then she's able to help then make a decision around what might work best for her school. So she's thinking deeply, she's doing that research around, okay, what is it that I need? and what's going to work well in my context, which I think is really good. Another thing she does, which is, I think, such a good idea, I wish someone had said this to me when I was first a subject leader, was she thinks about who's likely to be on board with the change, and who might, who's going to champion this, and who might be a bit more tricky to get on board, who might, who finds the change difficult. And she really thinks about how she can involve the teachers and bring staff with her. We can't just as a leader go, I want to do this and everyone else has just got to do whatever I say. It's just not going to work in that way as a middle leader. So when she goes to visit them, she actually brings a couple of members of staff with her, one being someone who she thinks could really help champion the change, and someone else who she thinks is a little bit more not feeling as optimistic about the change, to help bring them involve them in the decision. Very, very smart idea. And then she doesn't say, okay, right, we're doing this scheme, right, tomorrow everybody off you go and do it. She really invests time in action, in writing an action plan and breaking it down into, okay, so what do I need to change? What support will teachers need? She makes sure they've got that the training in there. She talks to parents, and then she trials some units in some classes. So she doesn't say, okay, we've got this new curriculum, we're going to start, everyone's going to start after half term. She trials some units, and then she was sort of ready then to go with it once all of those things have been put in place. And then finally on that, she didn't say, okay, right now we're done, on to the next thing. She then thinking about how they're going to embed that change. And that's the thing that I, as a subject leader, always got wrong, I think, was that I would be like, right, done, right, on to the next thing. It's like, you love that vision and strategy, but actually got to really spend some time making sure it's working, feeding in with the teachers, realizing that this is a massive thing to change and it's not going to work overnight. And you're going to need to monitor this for probably the next couple of years, really refining the changes that you've put in place, getting feedback from teachers and children and parents and everyone, just to make sure that it's working in your school. So I like this example, because I think as a subject leader, whatever it is you're changing, you could think, okay, let's follow Faye and follow that procedure, and it'd be useful, rather than just doing what I used to do, which was like, I want to make this change. I tell them all in the staff meeting, and then be really surprised that no one's doing it when I go to check.
Yeah, and that, as you say, that like sustaining change is probably more challenging than making the change in the first place, because people do, generally speaking, they often sort of will do stuff for a lesson or two, or maybe half a term, but it's so easy, it's normal, it's human to revert to habit and sort of revert back to sort of how you always did stuff, and so that's sort of keeping the focus on it, as you say, over potentially years, and not assuming that just because like with the kids, you don't do it until you get it right, you do it until you can't get it wrong, and it's sort of really well established.
And I think that's why lots of things fall, because we don't spend time sustaining the change, and then we go, oh, it didn't work, right, we'll do something else. And I think actually that is the piece that you really need to focus on, is how you embed that change, like you say, until it's not just working well some of the time, it's working well all of the time for everybody.
I promised that there was going to be time for folks to be able to ask questions directly to Alex about the book, about her experience, or anything history related. So please do drop your questions in the chat, or if you're feeling particularly brave, just throw yourself off mute. Ask directly, that's fine as well, but we have a couple of minutes now to take your questions directly, so I'm going to stop sharing, and please do feel free to ask directly.
Hi, can I ask a question? So I've just had to sort of change the whole of our curriculum for history. I've been at the school, it's my second year at the school, but I've had to sort of consolidate about 18 lessons that have gone over. So we teach history every other half of term, and what was happening, they were teaching one part, then they were going to geography, and then they were coming back to history, and by that point the children have forgotten and don't know, and then you're having to re-go everything again. So what I've tried to do is do units per half of term. So there's about 6 to 7 lessons. I've implemented inquiry questions along with like the disciplinary knowledge, so things like how did the Anglo-Saxons change life in Britain, and honing in and getting them to talk about cause and consequence and change and why. The biggest issue that we're having, even up in year 5 and year 6, is some of our children who have no English EAL. And even when we're doing the narratives and the storytelling and wanting them to actually answer a question and breaking it down, I think that is the part that is a real difference to what they were doing before. They were doing sort of booklet questions at the end. And it just wasn't in depth enough. So we've changed it to the inquiry question, but even now they are struggling, and we can do pictures and still do the narratives. It's how to assess their summative, like how do we know that they know what they know if they're unable to write it? And I think that's one of my difficulties that I'm trying to support staff with. Do you have any ideas of?
So the assessment chapter in the book talks quite a lot about assessment within history, and one of the things that sort of I tend to advise is that we assess in a number of different ways, so that if children have a barrier to, for instance, if a child's got a barrier to write in terms of writing some of that knowledge, how could you assess using other ways? So obviously verbally doing it, whether they can present it like that. In terms of the language, you were saying that children were struggling with actually just using language. I'd say, the fact that you've just started a new curriculum is going to mean that it will take time because they haven't got the background knowledge from before. I would say have an unrelenting focus on explicit teaching of vocabulary and lots of practice orally in classes. Like, really don't overlook that, getting sentence stems to get children to feel comfortable using it, lots of call and response, like really nail it with the vocabulary and getting them to talk about it. And then I would use a range of different, I think that in the chapter there's like sort of list of different ways that you can assess, so using things like quizzes, verbally, obviously having some written responses, discussions. So like remembering that what we're assessing in history, we obviously might want them to be able to write some of this stuff down, but actually, so how much have they learned in history? If they're able to do it verbally, then that's great. And I know that we have in our own trust schools sometimes had children that really struggle to write, but actually when I talk to them about history, wow, like blown away. So I would be looking at like what are all the strategies, and just having lots of different ones that you use. You don't have to just say this is our one way of doing it. What we always sort of think, we might have quizzes, we might have all sorts of different ways of assessing it. But I definitely say my biggest advice would be have that unrelenting focus on language and vocabulary.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I don't know if Jon has anything to add.
It's a really good question, and of course, like I think as you both said it, that like the reality is that's not something that changes overnight. That it's those are sort of like as Alex says, that focus on vocabulary. You'd like to think that in half a term it kind of in sports, but it's the sort of thing you only see after 2, 3, 4 years. And then you go to a school like West London Free School Primary, and you're like, oh my gosh, how on earth are these kids talking in this sort of way and writing in this way? And it's not what they'd be doing in that unit, it's that they've had that kind of language exposure and vocabulary over 4 or 5 years by that point. And so I guess it's tough because we always want something that's like, how can we solve this by Christmas? And really it often sort of takes a couple of years, I think. Folks, I'm afraid that we're very almost out of time. Shrianti, do you want to tell people where they can buy their thousands of copies of the books?
You've attended the webinar now, so you have to legally buy at least 1,000 copies each. But yes, the ISBN, my email address, as well as the series link are all in the chat for you now. And you can buy up to 20 copies of the book for a 10% discount on our website, or there are slightly larger bulk discounts that you can get through our team if you are buying in bulk for an academy or for a number of teacher colleagues at the same time. I have so many questions now for Alex as well, but I'll email you with them.
folks, we're at 46, and I want to respect your time, because I know you probably have quite dark drives home, or need to jump on trains, and appreciate that you've jumped on after a long school day in this darkest term. So thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully there was some stuff in there that was helpful, useful, interesting, and we very much, well, I hope that you enjoy the book as much as I have. Alex, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.